All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out here today at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Cross. Dr. Cross is a distinguished scientist hailing from the United States Geological Survey, whose interdisciplinary research transcends traditional boundaries, merging field ecology, animal behavior, and mathematical modeling to shed light on pressing disease and conservation challenges around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Dr. Cross earned his bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Virginia and his PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Cross went on to join the United States Geological Survey as a research wildlife biologist and has been there since 2005. Dr. Cross's scientific research has two main themes, including the integration of empirical data and mathematical modeling, and understanding the effects of host behavior on sea dynamics. At the moment, Dr. Cross has been focusing his research on bacilluses, chronic wasting disease, canine distemper, and dyspeptic mange. We eagerly anticipate what he will be presenting to us today and the valuable insights he will share about disease in Yellowstone. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Cross.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so as my introduction said, I do a range of sort of large mammal wildlife disease related things around the Yellowstone systems for US Geological Survey. And as you might know or might not, the US Geological Survey is sort of the science branch of Department of Interior. So our mission is sort of like, how do we deliver science to natural resource managers in a way that might, make their jobs easier and more better informed. So one of the sort of questions that sort of goes through this talk is like, how do we actually do science that actually has an impact with managers? And it's something that I've often thought about over time and have been more or less successful on different projects. So we'll talk about what that has looked like. So for the GYEs, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, like I've often talking around that area, so I don't have to describe some of these things, but for you guys that are a little bit more distant from it, there's a number of different like important moments in the history of Yellowstone and its ecology that have made a real difference. And so the Leopold report was the initial report that sort of said, well, we should not be hunting things in national parks to keep them at set levels. We should let nature sort of take its course. And that was in 1963. Then we had these dump closures where we had all these grizzly bears on dumps across the ecosystem, and the closures of those was an important moment. The 1988 fires, wolf reintroduction in 1995. Certainly climate change is going to be a big one for Yellowstone, but we don't have a specific year for what that looks like at the moment. And I guess the question for today is what will CWD do? So CWD is chronic wasting disease. It is a pathogenic, infectious prion affecting many cervids. It's got both direct and environmental forms of transmission. So there's lab trials where we can take infected animals, we can remove them from the environment, and then take naive animals and place them on the same spot of land, and then they can get infected. So that's what we mean by environmental transmission. It's stable in the environment, and that's sort of a property of these prion infections is that, as you guys probably know, prions are a protein that's been misshaped to a different three-dimensional structure. That three-dimensional new structure does not degrade in the same way that normal prions do, either in the body or in the environment. And so that's what creates the pathology, is that it builds up in the body, and in this case, builds up in the brain, and then that creates pathology, and then animals die. But also is stable in the environment for the same structural reasons. And we can't measure it very well, but there have been the lab study I was describing for the environmental transmission, that was a 2-year wait time before naive animals were put on that property. But there have been incidents of scrapie for sheep where they've been vacant for over a decade or longer and have yet become infected again on that same plot of land. So we haven't quite estimated what that decay rate is, but it's quite long. And as far as we know, is always fatal. There are different genetic forms of hosts that have a quicker or less quick progression of disease, but it always ends in death. Spreading geographically, and so far we have got limited efficacy of management interventions, and we'll talk about what some of those look like over time. So for today, we're going to talk a lot around these feed grounds in Wyoming that are both run by state and federal government. There's 23 to 22 different sites around this southern portion of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem that expands across this whole area, where animals, in particular elk and bison, are fed for anywhere from 3 to 5 months of the year. And the original intent of these feed grounds were that they've started anywhere from 1907 to the 1950s was the initiation of these feed grounds. And it was primarily the idea of that there was competition for haystacks of elk and bison on agricultural property, as well as the perceived sort of loss of winter range and trying to avoid winter die-offs. So that's one of the reasons why supplemental feeding was created in the first place. But as a result, there's like this increased aggregation during winter, which has itself created some disease problems that we haven't seen in the absence of the feed grounds in some cases, which has created an alternate reason why we're trying to separate elk and cattle for these disease purposes. And so then we are feeding them, which creates part of the problem, which is why we are then feeding them. And then we're just in this invirtuous cycle, looping back and forth. So I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here. We're going to talk a little bit about brucellosis, which is where I spent a long period of my research working on. And we'll then come back around to the CWD question after that. So brucellosis, it's a bacterial infection of cattle, bison, and elk around this region, causes and is transmitted by those abortion events. So it gravitates to the reproductive tissues, creates an abortion, and then individuals investigate those abortions, and then they get infected in that way. It's one of the most common zoonotic infections globally. It happens everywhere where people are sort of living in pastoral societies with their livestock. But in the US, it was widespread until the 50s and onwards until the 60s and 70s. It was on the decline, primarily from the USDA control in livestock, which was a test and remove program, then later supplemented with a vaccine program on top of that. Only now around the Yellowstone ecosystem within the United States. And previously, it was thought that elk were not a typical reservoir host for brucellosis. It was primarily around bison, and in this odd case of the supplemental feeding program in Wyoming, we saw it in elk there. But if you look elsewhere in elk across the country, you didn't see it. You don't see it in red deer in Europe. So they were thought not to be a particularly important reservoir host. And that was predominantly from we think it was predominantly from an ecological side and an aggregation side, that elk, when they're having their calves, sort of go off in seclusion for anti-predator sort of mechanism, and they're in low group sizes. So like the contact rate with those abortion events is quite low with normal earlier elk populations. But around the feed grounds, that mechanism is a little bit different.
The human health concerns, the humans can get infected with it too?
All the time. Just not in the United States, but it's one of the reasons why we pasteurize milk as well. So it can happen through that route, but now it's so well controlled within the United States, it's primarily a veterinary concern and only in this region. But elsewhere, it's quite common. Causes undulant fever, can last for many months, is hard to eradicate. A long sort of antibacterial medication is given. So one of the first weaponized agents. So it's actually on the select agent list for that reason. So we've done a whole host of different studies over a long period of time now. I'm getting older. And sort of through this, I've been thinking about like what sort of projects have actually like sort of impacted the management of this issue around the Yellowstone system. It's contentious because bison can get into contact with cattle, and then there's this spillover from bison and elk to cattle. It's originally a European infection that we probably brought over in our European cattle and then gave to wildlife a long time ago. And now we're getting it back again. So I'm just going to talk about two of those sort of, pretty simple studies that I think had a management impact. And then we'll come back around to that CWD question. So one of them was just to look at different feed grounds as being different things. And the disease prevalence at those feed grounds basically correlated with how long they were being fed there. So here the size of the dot, each dot is a different feed ground. The size of the dot's relative to the number of samples we had at that feed ground. So at that time, some feed grounds were not well sampled and others were. So we're weighting by that. And generally, those feed grounds that feed for longer in the season tend to have higher prevalence than those that don't. The density at any one particular feed ground is not quite as important as the duration in which it's being fed, because the transmission period, we think, and we've done various ways of measuring it, we think it's sort of in this phase, because all calves are being born out here in June, and abortions are tending to happen in this late third trimester. So there's a seasonal component to it, and not all feed grounds are operating during that high transmission season. So we've done some of this work, and then we did, and then we should know that feed grounds, although it's a management decision, like we're feeding them sometimes and not other times, but the management's actually driven by the ecology of the system, which is very much a snow-based sort of problem of, if we're not feeding them, then they're drifting onto agricultural properties, which is part of the reason why they had the feed grounds in the first place. So if it's a high snowpack year, or it's an area with lots of snow, then they're being fed for longer in those years and in those places. So there's a pretty tight correlation between the snow water equivalent here and how long they're feeding them. And the black dots are like more recent years where they're trying to reduce the feeding, but sometimes the years don't really allow them to do that in a political way. So another experiment, one of the experiments we did here was just to feed them differently. So we're interested in contact, how contact relates to transmission. So here we're feeding them so we can just feed them differently to affect contact, and can that then affect disease transmission. So we talked to feeders that are traditionally feeding them in this way, just dumping hay off the hay studs as fast as they can to then sort of move it around, and then we can measure sort of contact rates during those two different things. And we sort of find the obvious, but sometimes just, describing the magnitude is sometimes useful. And that's what we do here. We just say like, yes, it is incredibly important if you could spread things out more broadly than if you do it in this highly concentrated manner. So from this study and the previous study, the Game and Fish State Agency was willing to then change what they were doing on feed grounds to then try, to the extent that they could, to feed in this way and to shorten the feeding season as much as possible. That turned out to be not quite as effective as we thought it would be. Results like this one and the previous one, we thought that this would be, a very strong ecological intervention at a time when the vaccine we were also showing the vaccine was ineffective. So this is one of the few things that we thought that they could be doing. They tried it. It's unclear whether it was particularly effective. We thought that this was the system because nowhere else, again, was like brucellosis in elk populations. So we had this fairly simplistic understanding of what the system, how the system works, that snowpack drives feeding. as a result of the feeding, we get this aggregation that creates brucellosis. But actually, there's like these other two factors going on here, and we need to be a little bit more sophisticated. That aggregation is a product in this system of both the feeding, it is a function of the feeding, but snowpack is also driving aggregation of elk populations. And as population sizes are changing and increasing in size over time, then that's also creating aggregations and higher contact rates. So just because we dropped out the feeding or we've modified the feeding in some way, we still have these other drivers that are still contributing to disease transmission in this system. So the changes that we made here and to shortening the season, just because we've stopped feeding them doesn't mean that spring hasn't yet come. And so they're still being aggregated as a response to the lack of springtime forage. So while we were doing these studies and sort of appreciating these other routes by which aggregation leads to brucellosis, we start seeing these patterns outside of the feed ground. So these are just two different regions that are far away from the feed ground, but still in the general system. So they can get long distance dispersal events that start the epidemic, but they're not sort of dynamically linked to them in important ways. So this is what we thought all along, that prevalence is very low up until the 2000s. This is why we didn't think that elk were an appropriate reservoir host species. But then in the mid-2000s, when I come into the system, then things start changing. And it's now sort of an equivalent prevalence outside of the feed grounds as it is in the feed grounds themselves. So if we do sort of model-based estimates of different management units around the system, here are our feed grounds down here in 1990 and low prevalence elsewhere. And then by 2014, we've sort of got it all over the Yellowstone ecosystem. And the cattle cases are, roughly coincident with that. The cattle cases are few in number. There's only 1, 2, 3 different cattle herds being infected in that region over a pretty long time span. But the concern from a national perspective is that there's been 40 years of control effort to keep it contained or to eradicate it within cattle. And cattle are moved frequently across the country. And so if it gets out of that area and then spreads, then you've sort of reduced the whole point of the control program for the last 40 years. So there's still an emphasis on how do we contain this thing within the Yellowstone, even though it's a relatively few number of herds that are actually being impacted. Okay, so that gives you some sort of context for where we come to CWD. We're working on these feed grounds for brucellosis reasons, trying to reduce this spillover problem. And sort of in the backdrop, along comes like CWD. It's primarily in southeastern Wyoming and in Colorado. And over time, it's sort of spreading towards the Yellowstone ecosystem. And now only recently has it sort of been detected, but it's still in pretty low prevalence all around the Yellowstone ecosystem. But because it's low prevalence and is a very slow disease to develop, like we're at that phase where field work or field-based studies would be really challenging because the prevalence is like less than 1%. So how are you going to get any sample size if you're trying to study anything that's positive? It is correlated with some declines in mule deer and white-tailed deer in Wyoming. Here's where I think it'll be a little bit different how it plays out here in Georgia compared to here in Wyoming and Yellowstone. In the East Coast and in the sort of Mideastern areas of the US, the systems are much more productive for deer. And so like layering on this sort of chronic disease at a time when they're also overabundant, like I don't think that you guys are going to notice a hell of a lot of impacts of CWD. That's my prediction. But for sort of low productivity, dry conditions that we get in the Western United States, the impact of CWD is sort of on top of a much lower productivity system. So that's where I'm a little bit more concerned out there. Recently detected in the region. And so this is now changing some of the discussion around like the relative costs and benefits of how these feed grounds operate in the future. And so here's one, we've got this Forest Service decision. So Forest Service has managed property for federal properties on which 8 of the feed grounds reside. They permit the state game agency to do the feeding on that federal property. So they have to decide whether they're going to continue to permit the state game agency to do that on federal property. So this is one of those sites where they have a permit. The feed ground is right on this side. The agricultural interest is right on the opposite side. You're sitting here in the car right here, taking that picture of cattle here, and just off to the right is the feed ground and the livestock property. So some feed grounds are like this, of high sort of wildlife cattle interaction and potential conflict. Other sites are like there's no cattle anywhere around. It's mostly there for the idea that it will mitigate winter severity and keep populations high for hunting purposes. So the U.S. Forest Service feed grounds, they permit 8 of the feed grounds, all of these guys with a date, and those permits are all going to expire between now and 2028. And they have to re-up their permits, and those permits tend to be of a 20-year time span. And so that's where we sort of like enter into this conversation, we as the USGS and as researchers trying to inform that management decision about the pros and cons of the feeding. And that's what I'll talk about next. So the National Environmental Protection Act, the NEPA Act, requires federal agencies to assess what their environmental impacts might be before they're going to do an action. So that's NEPA. And there's a specific thing that you have to do with NEPA. There's all these requirements. You have to decide why, what's the purpose of the thing you're doing? What's the affected environment? What are some different management alternatives? And then what are the consequences of those? And then you come to a decision. Lots of environmental impact statements, which are written to comply with NEPA, are sort of in a qualitative sort of sense of like, they do all of this qualitatively in their assessment. But what we're trying to do here is to do a more structured decision sort of process. And in the structured decision-making process, we have lots of the same components. We need to decide what is the decision. We work with the decision makers to understand what are their objectives. What are the alternatives that they're willing to consider? Then we need to do the consequence analysis of how those alternatives and objectives relate to one another. And then we can evaluate trade-offs and help them come to a decision. So we're trying to embed this process into the NEPA process. But lots of the same common elements. But one of the challenges here was the NEPA process has a set timeline on which they have to operate. So that means when we're doing this one, we're on the same timeline. So some things that we would think of like, oh, I'd love to do that project, but I can't do that within the 3-month time span that I've got to do all the rest of the things. So we do what we can here, but we've got specific tools for structuring how we have these conversations around your objectives and the alternatives. This is sort of more of a meeting facilitation and social science sort of part to like really get them as flexible as possible about what you might entertain as options. Some objectives are just a means to another objective. And so you're trying to identify those things too. Like you're not really interested in disease prevalence, maybe even. You're interested in, can I continue hunting them? That might be like one thing where it's not, you understand later on that those objectives are just a means to an end. So then I'm in here trying to do sort of the technical part of trying to assess the consequences and trade-offs. So these, like many decision makers, they're weighing many different objectives. They're often trying to do multiple different objectives at the same time. So this was no different. In this case, we had 12 different management objectives. And in this case, their alternatives I thought were like pretty narrow in what they were willing to entertain in the alternatives. You know, they had continued feeding, phase out over time, just stop immediately, or emergency feed when they need to. Part of that is because that they were willing to entertain just those things that they had jurisdiction over. And so the federal Forest Service does not have jurisdiction over hunting regulations and other things you might put into this soup of like, what are all your alternatives? And doing those becomes more difficult in the structured decision making because now you're doing two different players who have different decisions and different objectives and how to weigh them both. So here's our analysis structure. We have a model that gives us sort of temporal dynamics over time. And from that, we're going to get a couple of these metrics which we're tying to their objective. Like for every objective, we're trying to have a metric that can be measured. So the temporal model gives us a couple metrics. Then we've got to have a spatial model also, because some of the metrics are spatial in their like overlap of elk and cattle on agricultural property and disease risk as a result. So that's a spatial process. So we've got other metrics for that. The elk abortions, that's like that transmission rate to cattle again for the brucellosis concerns. And then we've got some economic indicators as well that in this case was tied to hunting revenues, both at the regional level and for the state game agency. So that's the overall structure. The CWD model sort of gives you like things that you would expect, but we have to like tailor this model now to address all the different alternatives. So like phase out was pretty easy, but then we've got this emergency feeding that's triggered every so often. We have to like assess what is the transmission rate for CWD in an elk population that is fed. Well, we don't have that as a existing data set in hand. This is a little bit of a unique case. We've got some indication from game farms, but that data is like not particularly strong and not particularly available either. And then we've got the unfed case. So we have to come up with something here. We do it with an expert elicitation process where we get experts that know things about elk and chronic wasting disease. We have a toy model with them to play with, and we allow them to sort of choose what parameters they think are most reasonable for this situation. And then we've got ways of aggregating those and assessing the uncertainty and expert opinion. So that's what we do. We allow for some infection between fed and unfed elk, but we also have to have this implied assumption or explicit assumption here also about what happens if we don't feed elk. Even if there's no disease, what's the penalty that might be associated with just pulling the feed grounds but not even having CWD there? And so in that case, again, we don't have a data set to go to estimate that parameter. So here, what we did was we just looked at areas with feeding, which are all of these, compared to areas without feeding, and what's their density of elk in the wintertime for those two different regions. And it happens that these areas like are 23% less than those areas that have feeding in them. So that's where we took like our estimate of like the consequences of pulling the feeding. It's both a social consequence as well as maybe an ecological one. But the social consequence is we pull the feeding, elk are getting in trouble in places where managers don't want them. And so they hunt or remove animals in those areas as a result. That can happen combined with, yes, we have more severe winters that aren't mitigated by the feeding program. That could also happen. Okay, so we get modeling results that look like this. This is a disease that takes a very long time to sort of like evolve, like to play out. It's very slow. We have populations of fed elk and unfed elk, and they decline over time relative to the prevalence of the disease, because we're thinking that from the available evidence, we think that animals tend to survive for about 3 to 4 years post-infection. This is in rough alignment with what we know in the field and other areas. Like, we've predicted from other places with their mortality rates and their vital rates that when CWD is above 13% in a lot of these regions, we think populations should decline, even in the absence of any hunting effects. And then Lead Cave National Park has elk with CWD that's 18% overall right now, but in some regions they can show that it's 30% in that region. So we sort of think that we're in the ballpark here with our expert elicitation process of we're about 40% for fed elk, which is higher than what we've observed anywhere else. But we think it's in the ballpark given that we see some populations with a little bit less than that are not fed. And unfed elk, you know, around the 13 to 20% sort of range over a 20-year time span. So then we have this like spatial sort of habitat model as well. So we've got to sort of like take our temporal sort of like population counts and basically like put them in space to see where they would align under different alternatives. And so what we have is sort of like a habitat selection model where we have feed grounds operating in the winter. So this is the fed group of elk that are concentrated on feeding sites in the region. And then for the different alternatives, we can play games with this where we remove this feeding point and then they have to redistribute to other regions. And that's how we like match it with alternatives. And then the model sort of, a temporal model tells us how many elk are in the fed and unfed groups. And then we sort of like combine this with layers about like private property and cattle. So as you might expect, you get higher prevalence in scenarios where you're continuing to feed them compared to when you're not feeding them. And population sizes decline over time, but the magnitude of these differences is not strong, like compared to the uncertainty, which I'm not showing you here. But the magnitude of these differences is not that strong in this case, and there are 2 reasons for that. One is that there's 2 ways in which you get to lower population size. One is that the disease itself is affecting population size, but then you also have that 23% penalty. Even in the case where you're not feeding them, they're going to decline also. So you have that operating, but also in this case, we're aggregating things to the spatial scale of the management unit, which is much larger than a single feed ground. So these feed grounds are relatively small, several hundred individuals, but the management unit is several thousand. And so whatever you do on that small proportion just doesn't sort of elevate to like suggest large differences on either metric relative to the predictive uncertainty here, which we're probably still underestimating. But again, this is just one feed ground. And we've already said, like, in the back of our minds, we have 7 more for Forest Service, and then we've got another big one coming up for the Fish and Wildlife Service that we might make the same decision many different times. And so now we're sort of aggregating multiple decisions together. But before I get to that, so now we get to the consequence table. And this is like what managers will see to like, how do I evaluate all the trade-offs that might be happening in a management decision? We've isolated for them what they think their objectives are and what the metrics are for how we measure those. And then we have their alternatives as columns. And so like what we're trying to isolate is like blue is good and light blue or white is not good. What we're trying to isolate is these sort of trade-offs that like, this alternative is good for these metrics, but not good for other metrics. So then you can't actually come to a decision just from this either, because now you have to also understand what your weighting is of some metrics. Some are more important to you than others. So then there's another process that happens after this for managers to walk through of like, well, to elicit from them which objectives are more important than others. And then with the weighting, you could then sort of do an optimization given the weighting. In this case, in the single feed ground case, a lot of these like differences amongst alternatives, like we said before, is like small relative to the standard deviations of our uncertainty. But generally, feeding is minimizing risk of brucellosis and the eating of cattle haystacks and private property damage. So that's all of these metrics, but no feeding is sort of maximizing population size at year 20 and number of harvested. So these are your trade-offs. So then we sort of like scale this up to be like, okay, well, what if you're doing this across many different areas? What does that cumulative effect sort of look like? And in this case, Forest Service only controls a portion of the system, you know, those feed grounds that are on federal properties. So now we have sort of scenarios where Forest Service phases out those properties, but the state game agency continues to feed in other places, or they both see the writing on the wall and they both decide to do the same thing, either feed them or not feed them. And so you get these intermediate cases between them. Phase out has this sort of like generation of the train starts moving. And once you've got it going, you sort of end up in a different place. It doesn't default to no feeding. Just 3 years of feeding sort of defaults to like a much higher prevalence than if you didn't feed for those 3 years, even for a short phase out. So we have this temporal trade-off also. So this is that like no feeding penalty that happens, that 23% decline sort of penalty. That's right here that happens early. And with phase out, you don't have that penalty until after the 3rd year. So this is the no feeding alternative, but then there's also lower CWD costs that are incurred over the longer term with this no feeding scenario. Less disease, less costs associated with that. But with the feeding scenario, we have no early costs, but then we have late costs that happen later on. And then we have this trade-off point, you know, that probably happens somewhere between 5 and 15 years, where one alternative is doing better in the beginning, but not better at the end. And then there's lots of uncertainty around all of this. So then when we roll this all up across all feed grounds, across all the different regions, we get this sort of dynamic that yes, for the brucellosis concerns, we still have this prediction that continued feeding would minimize those, but on all other metrics, the no feeding actually outperforms them. And that's sort of where the Forest Service currently sits. They are currently deciding on those 2 feed grounds now. They have 6 more coming. They haven't made their decision yet. It's out for public review, and then they take that public review, and then they make their decision. Simultaneously, the National Elk Refuge, which is a Fish and Wildlife Service site right outside of Jackson. This is the town of Jackson, Wyoming right here, and this is the National Elk Refuge right here. The Fish and Wildlife Service is making the same decision all over again, but they've got some additional things that they're worried about. For one, they have this like huge interface of suburban territory that is different to other feed grounds. They have 8,000 elk that are here, whereas most other feed grounds are around 800. And they have 600 bison that are also here, that if they're not fed, then they have, you know, consequences for, you know, they're trying to conserve bison at the same time, but bison are going to have some potential consequences with suburban territory as well. So we're doing the same process over again with Fish and Wildlife Service, but it's going to have like a bit of a different flavor because it's like more complicated, different metrics, but some similar dynamics, some different in magnitude.
Oh, the CWD is by present?
What's that?
The CWD effect by isn't it?
Not that we know of. There's been lots of work on that for the concern also with it spilling over into cattle. The challenge trials suggested it'd be very hard. There is a strong species barrier, and yet it has jumped species barriers in the past. So it's one of those things of you can't never say never, but yet current evidence suggests that it's unlikely. So here are my takeaways coming into the structured decision-making process. I was sort of vaguely aware of it, and then this was my first sort of trial by fire to see it actually in play. These are what I took away from it as sort of like the technical person. You know, there's a lot of pros to it. What I like about it is that it is a merger of science and your values. Like the social values are very much present in there. You have to decide what your objectives are, and you have to weight what those objectives are. So that's your social component at play, and then the science sort of like merges with that. It encourages transparency in your decision-making process and creativity and like talking out like what are all your different options. You know, should reduce bias and focus on the objectives that truly matter. There's some difficulties though that I found, but I wouldn't say that I don't have alternatives at the moment that I would propose like, oh, let's do this instead. You know, for me as a scientist sort of being in on a technical team, it pushed me to areas that I was not wholly comfortable with, where I'm having to do models that I would not do otherwise. Like I would not do this for a scientific paper because I'm making these assumptions that I don't like making. And if I'm just trying to make a case for the science paper, I don't necessarily have to make that assumption. But if I'm trying to tailor my thing to the question at hand, like you sort of need to make that level of commitment. And if you're not making those assumptions, like, well, then it's just everybody's internal assumption in their own mind, you know, that's weighing against your sort of modeling assumption. And I'll take my transparency of the model over the opaque, you know, mental assumption that everybody's making. We had some significant timeline and resource constraints. You tend to be optimizing for a given decision maker in this case. And so there's some territory there of like, you're not always making an optimal societal decision. You maybe are just targeting an optimal decision for that decision maker. And in government, for me, there's a lot of challenge between how do you share the costs and benefits across management agencies? In this case, between state and federal governments, that they choose one thing, but that's incurring a cost on their partner. And then how does that get sort of like shared, the benefits and costs shared? Not easy. And there's actions outside the decision maker's control. So they weren't willing to do those alternatives where there's hunting as part of their alternatives because they're like, I can't control what those are, so I don't know what you're gonna put in there. And then this was a key one that's happening right at the moment now, where you've done all this work with your local decision maker on what they're thinking of. But then for political reasons, it's important enough that that decision is not made at just the local level. It gets elevated to higher and higher levels with whom you haven't done all this buy-in into the process of like, this is why we're thinking this way. This is how we've generated trust in this process to get to this point. It's elevated out of your hands, and in this case, into DC, at which point I don't have the same connections to sort of help walk them through, like, how are we at this point? So that's a challenge as well. So I think this is a pretty important moment for what happens in Yellowstone. I do think it's going to be important. The magnitude of the changes we're suggesting here are at times like 60% reductions in the dominant, you know, ungulate of the ecosystem. So I think that's pretty important. And at the moment, management agencies have not sort of like declared what their preferred alternative is. So it's like right at this moment where like important things might happen. And it's going to happen either way. If they do nothing, well, they commit to a CWD trajectory. If they choose to not feed, well, then they commit to that one, and there's going to be cons on both sides. So getting back to that question of like, how do we have an impact with the science that we're trying to do? For me, sometimes I think of it this way. I mean, you could put model specificity here. I think like lab projects are also, vary in the degree to which they're like really specific to their system of interest or really trying to identify a general process. And then we've got management application. It's sort of in the near term. Here, I think this is like academics are in this world here, some of them anyway, are in this world of, potentially low specificity, but low management application, but it's getting at general principles upon which we're going to build to do other things. That project was out here, a very high model specificity, but directly addressing the management question at hand. And I generally try to be somewhere on this like diagonal, because on the off diagonal, I don't know what those look like, and sometimes they're not great. I don't know how to make this one. And this one, I don't think you should go here either, because here you just haven't committed enough. You're like got this really specific thing. Your readership is like this big. Nobody's like, you've got very small readership, and yet you haven't committed to actually get to the application yet. So I've been here, but I don't recommend it. If you're here, you want to push to like you want to go further in to really communicate with your decision makers about what's really at their disposal. I was talking about this with somebody else today. Like decision makers, like when are they going to make a decision? They need three things. They need their means of doing it. They need the logistics or the finances. They need the mandate to do it, and they need the motivation to do it. And without those three, like it doesn't happen. Okay, so this is the research chart that I think all PIs have in their mind, some version of it, but they don't bother to write it out, but I bothered to write it out because I was like thinking about this talk. So should you do a project as a student? Should you do it? Usually you start with like, oh, I can do that now. I've got that skill set. Yes. Or should I develop that skill set to do that idea that I've just thought of? And then you're like looking through the literature. Has it been done? Okay, you're like, oh man, got it. Like now I've got an idea, I can do it. And it hasn't been done before. Usually it sort of stops there, and then you go to your advisor, and the advisor says like, well, you could also be like, it's been done, but it needs to be done a different way, or it needs to be done again for some reason. And then we get to like, is it general knowledge about a process? Is it going to be useful generally? No. Well, if no, well, then does it have application? Like, I hope so. If it's not useful generally, I hope it has like some specific use. If it's like, I want to know if it's fun. Like, if it's not going to be fun, if it's going to be working with people I don't like, then well, it better be important. Yeah. And then is it like, am I the right person to be doing this project? Like some projects, I'm just like, I think you should have somebody else do that project, like not me. And do I have time? Do I have better projects? And then do I have funding? And all these other reasons are like, no, do not do that thing. And do it later goes to don't do it. Because it also comes back to, do I have time and will I get a better project? And usually there will be a better one, and you don't do it. So that's all I got for you.
Can I ask you a question? Very nice talk. I'm wondering about population dynamics in itself. So how is the reproduction of a population intrinsically dependent on what the population density is?
I mean, it is partially, and that's built into the models in a way, like we account for that in some ways. It's not well estimated because in most cases, like the populations are being heavily controlled through the hunting process. And so because they're being controlled in that way, you don't get large swings in the population size that would allow you to estimate the density effects that you might like to see. But it is in there. So we are accounting for that as they drop in population size, we're expecting them to actually reproduce better. But even beyond that, the disease still is like sufficient to probably reduce population size by quite a bit. And in these areas, in many of these areas, the population density, because it is quite high, the reproductive rates are actually quite low. And that's sort of why you get this dynamic of even just a little disease could turn the tide to being like declining population size because, well, there's a lot of them right now and they're not very productive.
Okay.
So just, I like your diagonal and all of that. And I think, so one of the questions I have is when you deal with these applicable science questions and you deal with stakeholders and agency, and this comes in all sorts of people who do that vaccination, public health, or, for me, it's very different, but monarch butterflies, whether people should breed them or not. I would feel like there are people out there that you want to show the science, but they just don't buy it because they don't believe it. How often do you run into that? Or, how do you cultivate that trust that people actually listen to what your models are saying?
Well, like in this case, we're cultivating that at the management, at the decision maker level. So that's why I was like disappointed that then like, oh, this decision just like vaporized into the upper echelons and like haven't gone through the process to really understand how do we get to this point. We will definitely have that issue with communicating to the public on this decision right now. We've had the public commentary, and it's pretty legitimate commentary that's going to be difficult to sort of reply to. I need to figure out what my strategy is. The public commentary it comes from two sides. The one side is we have not seen CWD have dramatic impacts yet. And so you're choosing a course of action that we're pretty sure is going to have negative consequences against this one that we have unknown consequences for, and I don't get it. Like, I think the known consequence of pulling the feeding is going to be worse than this unknown consequence of CWD. They have a point there. And yet, I still think the feed grounds are of a different nature than anything previous. And so making that analogy of like, that will be part of like, how do we talk about it? How do we say that that's not an appropriate analogy? The other side of it is that we look at elk populations in many other places that don't have a feeding program, and they seem to be doing just fine. So I don't know why like we're still doing that here, and yet having this possible like very negative CWD consequence. And you can see how both sides they've got morsels of information in both of them, and I think that's going to be a very important public relations issue. I think that's where you get the social scientists in there. Like, we can't do it all. I don't think we can do it all. I think we need help on those things. But I agree that like it feels like we're getting more and more demands to do all things well. Like, do your science well, do your public communication well, do your integration across scales well. It's difficult.
I was wondering, like, in terms of kind of the stakeholders, are there like indigenous groups in that area that might have like input on this process for wildlife management or interest in that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of tribal connections to this. And initially, that was one of the things that sort of like held up some of the decision-making process because higher leadership was sort of like, we need to do a better job of integrating sort of the tribal component to this. And I'm just, there's not a direct interaction in this stuff yet. Many of the tribes do have hunting rights in these areas. Many of those hunting rights precede the formation of Yellowstone National Park. So it is there. There's a recent New York Times piece this last year or the year before on the tribal hunt for bison on the northern side of Yellowstone. And it's challenging. There's not a good solution there either, I think. People didn't like the optics of a heavy hunt of bison by tribes on the border. And yet in the absence of that, we were putting them on trucks and slaughtering them in facilities. So, I mean, for me, I guess I'll choose the not savory tribal hunt over shipping them off as cattle to a meat processing facility, but neither one's great.
I have a question, I guess it's more about kind of broader Yellowstone ecology. So it sounds like, I guess if the decision is made to kind of remove the feeding grounds, you'll definitely get a decrease in the elk population. And as CWD kind of emerges, you also will probably get a decrease in the elk population. I don't know anything about Yellowstone ecology, but I guess my intuition is that the current elk population is probably much higher than it has been historically due to like the absence of wolves. I guess now you have them. So my question is like, given that it seems like perhaps whatever choice is made, you're going to get a decline in the elk population. What are, like, could you speculate about what the kind of like downstream
Larger
effects of that,
consequences?
yeah, will be on the overall ecosystem?
I mean, some of them are easier than others to know about. The hunting consequences, like we've done the metrics on like the amount that the hunting brings into local regional economies. And so here over the 20-year time span, we were in the hundreds of millions, you know, sort of.
Loss.
Well, this was just like, what is this? That was the total. It's probably on the order of hundreds of millions in terms of loss over 20 years. But for each alternative, we were in that ballpark for the value of the hunting resource. It was in the tens of millions for just the license revenue to the state game agency. And so that would be sort of like across 3 different game agencies, like their potential hit to their license fees. And I mean, they're all just a portion of their total management budget. But across the GYE, I think we were like about, what was I thinking? Like 3/4 of the elk are fed in that bottom half of the Yellowstone ecosystem. So it's like, it's a large number of elk that are fed. It's not a small portion that are fed. Other consequences, I mean, we've thought a little bit about like, what happens to grizzly bears? Because grizzly bears eat a bunch of elk calves during certain times of year. They are scavenging off of dead animals, you know, when they come out of hibernation. Obviously, wolves are a primary predator of elk. We would anticipate wolf populations to sort of like mirror elk populations as they decline. You know, all the stuff with wolves you could see play out again of like, oh, well, there's a regeneration of cottonwoods and willow stands along riverine habitats because we have less elk. Like that could happen also in the future as like ecological consequences. We've done some of that work on like, you know, how much do we think wolves would impact CWD, but it gets in this territory where again, we've got like many assumptions and lots of uncertainty. And this is where like, I think the model is useful for understanding how to think about it, but I don't think it's useful for prediction. But one way to think about that one in this case is that we have a bit of a disconnect between wolves like to eat young animals predominantly, and disease is concentrated in older animals in this case. And so until we see the flip-flop, like it's possible that wolves may have a hard time controlling CWD unless their selection for infected animals starts pulling them away from the uninfected juveniles, and they're eating infected adults instead. And if we see that switch, then we're like, oh, okay, this might be an important sort of component. But if they keep eating juveniles, they might not actually do much on CWD.
Maybe I missed this, but in the no feeding scenario, is that assuming that they're just gonna go back to feeding on hay at the farms, like in the cattle ranges, or is there some way to protect that?
Well, so in the modeling framework, that's just sort of subsumed with like, we think there's gonna be less elk because they're gonna get into trouble and then they're gonna get removed. Within also within the modeling framework, we sort of model how like, oh, if they're not here, they're gonna be on these properties instead. And so we tally that up as a metric to weigh your decision. Even though they might not stay over there for very long, it's still like important to sort of characterize like, oh yeah, you could get a large increase in that metric you don't want. But in terms of the biology of what might happen, yes, they will probably go onto like agricultural property. We probably will have short-term consequences of disease spillover to cattle. But then it's going to be, have the counteracting effect of, well, management's going to then step in on private properties and do their thing too. So it's a little hard to say how it all play out, but in some cases they won't allow it to happen.
All right, wonderful. Well, let's thank Paul once more.